Good evening. And I want to begin tonight with a map. Not the kind of map you see in textbooks, not the kind framed in embassies, not the kind that shows borders in neat colors and labels in clean fonts. This was a map that existed only inside the Kremlin. A map that Vladimir Putin believed in. A map where Ukraine did not really exist as a sovereign country, where Kyiv was not a capital, but a temporary administrative inconvenience, where resistance was symbolic, where leadership would flee, where citizens would submit, where tanks would roll, flags would rise, and the world would eventually shrug. That map was wrong. And on the night Russian forces crossed into Ukraine, that wrong map began to collapse. In February of 2022, the Russian military launched what it believed would be a rapid decapitation strike, a lightning operation designed to overwhelm Ukraine's government, seize major cities, and install a compliant regime before the world could organize a response. This was supposed to be over in days. Russian airborne troops were sent toward Kyiv's outskirts, armored columns poured across multiple borders, cruise missiles struck airfields and command centers, cyber attacks targeted infrastructure, and behind it all was a simple assumption: Ukraine would fold. It didn't. What happened instead was something Putin's system had not prepared for. The Ukrainian government did not flee. President Volodymyr Zelensky did not disappear. Ministers stayed, parliament stayed, local officials stayed, and that single decision to remain rewrote the war. Because once Kyiv did not fall, everything changed. Russian forces expected chaos. They found coordination, they expected confusion, they found communication, they expected fear, they found defiance. Ukrainian soldiers, many of them reservists and volunteers, flooded into defensive positions. Civilians built barricades, tech workers built tracking systems, farmers dragged abandoned armored vehicles off roads, citizens filmed troop movements and shared them with the military. The invasion had collided with a society that had quietly been preparing for this moment since 2014. For 8 years, Ukraine had studied Russian tactics. For 8 years, they had rebuilt their army. For 8 years, they had learned that survival depended on readiness. And now they were ready. Meanwhile, Russia's military, so carefully polished for parades and press releases, began revealing its weaknesses. Convoys stalled for lack of fuel. Units lost contact. Commanders improvised. Supply trucks vanished. Soldiers scavenged. Some ran out of food. Some ran out of ammunition. Some ran out of purpose. Intelligence had promised a welcome. Reality delivered hostility. Entire villages refused cooperation. Locals poisoned food, destroyed road signs, reported movements, blocked paths. Every mile became contested. Every hour cost lives. This was not a blitzkrieg. This was attrition, and Russia was losing it. As Kyiv held, Western governments began recalculating. What they had expected to be a short war was becoming something else, and something else demanded something else. The United Kingdom was among the first to move decisively. Anti-tank weapons, training missions, intelligence support, quiet coordination, then the United States, then Europe, then NATO as a whole. What began as cautious assistance became systematic support, not to provoke, not to escalate recklessly, but to prevent collapse. Every shipment mattered. Every system changed the battlefield. Javelins stopped armor, Stingers stopped helicopters, drones mapped positions, encrypted radios restored coordination. Ukraine began learning faster than Russia could adapt, and slowly Russian momentum broke. Outside Kyiv, Ukrainian forces counterattacked. Bridges were destroyed, supply lines cut, encircled units abandoned equipment, elite formations retreated, the capital survived, and when it did, the myth of Russian inevitability died. Inside the Kremlin, this was a shock. Putin had not planned for a prolonged war. He had not planned for mobilization. He had not planned for mass casualties. He had not planned for sanctions at this scale. He had not planned for unity among democracies. He had planned for obedience. And he did not get it. By the spring of 2022, Russia had lost tens of thousands of soldiers, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, billions of dollars. And something harder to measure: credibility, the image of competence, the aura of control, the sense of inevitability. It was gone. And Ukraine had become something new, not a victim, not a buffer state, not a bargaining chip, a frontline democracy, a military innovator, a national resistance movement, a symbol. The night Putin's map failed was the night this war became unwinnable for him, because from that moment on, Ukraine was no longer fighting alone, it was fighting with time. with attention, with allies, with legitimacy, and with the people who had decided that surrender was not an option. This was not just a military failure, it was a moral miscalculation, a political disaster, a historical error. And in the next part of this series, we're going to examine how Russia's military, once feared, once respected, once mythologized, turned out to be dangerously unprepared for the war it was ordered to fight. Because what we are watching is not just a battlefield story. It is the story of what happens when power believes its own lies. It is about the machine, because wars are not fought by speeches. They are not fought by television appearances or historical essays or carefully staged patriotic rallies. Wars are fought by systems, by logistics chains, by fuel trucks, by maintenance crews, by training cycles, by officers who know what they're doing, by soldiers who understand why they're there. And what this war has exposed slowly, brutally, in full view of the world is that the Russian military system Vladimir Putin sent into Ukraine was not the machine he believed it was. It was hollow. For years, Putin had invested enormous resources into reshaping Russia's armed forces. After the brief but embarrassing operational failures during the 2008 war with Georgia, the Kremlin initiated sweeping military reforms. Billions were allocated for modernization. New tanks were unveiled, hypersonic missiles were showcased, fighter jets roared over Red Square during Victory Day parades. The message was unmistakable. Russia was back, but parades are not proof of readiness. And spectacle is not the same thing as sustainability. Behind the polished imagery was a system plagued by corruption so deep it had become structural. Defense contracts were inflated. Equipment budgets disappeared into patronage networks. Maintenance records were falsified. Training exercises were scripted for optics rather than realism. Officers were promoted for loyalty over competence. In authoritarian systems, bad news does not travel upward easily. And so the Russian military began believing its own reports. When Russian forces rolled toward Kyiv, they did so under the assumption that their supply lines would function, their communications would remain secure, and their combined arms coordination would overwhelm Ukrainian defenses. Instead, logistics collapsed almost immediately. Convoys stretched for miles, exposed and stationary. Fuel trucks failed to arrive. Soldiers abandoned armored vehicles because they had no gasoline. Rations ran out. Tires, cheap, poorly manufactured substitutes for what had been budgeted, literally fell apart under the weight of heavy vehicles. What looked on satellite imagery like an unstoppable advance was, in reality, a stalled column of confusion. And as Ukrainian forces adapted, targeting supply vehicles rather than tanks, ambushing rear positions rather than frontal assaults, the weaknesses became fatal. Russia's military doctrine depends on coordinated movement between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. It is complex. It requires communication, timing, and training. Instead, units entered Ukraine fragmented. Air support was inconsistent. Communications were unsecured. Soldiers used civilian cell phones. Ukrainian intelligence intercepted calls. Artillery fired without proper reconnaissance. Elite airborne units, the VDV, long considered among Russia's most capable forces, were deployed early in the invasion in high-risk operations around Hostomel Airport near Kyiv. The expectation was swift seizure and reinforcement. What followed was devastating losses. These were not expendable units. These were supposed to be the tip of the spear, and they were blunted in weeks. Then came the conscripts. Despite official assurances that only professional contract soldiers would participate, evidence mounted that young, poorly trained conscripts were being sent into combat. Many did not know they were entering a full-scale war until they crossed the border. Families reported sons who had been told they were on exercises. Training deficiencies became impossible to hide. Reports surfaced of units lacking basic coordination, of friendly fire incidents, of soldiers unfamiliar with their own equipment, of commanders improvising in real time because planning assumptions had collapsed. This was not a modernized expeditionary force. This was a military straining under the weight of its own mythology. And mythology cannot refuel a tank. It cannot repair a transmission. It cannot teach a platoon how to maneuver under fire. As casualties mounted, the Kremlin faced a dilemma. To admit failure would be politically dangerous, but to continue the war without manpower would be militarily impossible. And so, in September 2022, Vladimir Putin announced what he had carefully avoided for months: partial mobilization. Hundreds of thousands of Russian men were called up. The announcement triggered immediate consequences. Airports filled with men attempting to leave the country. Borders with Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Finland saw traffic surge. Protests erupted in regional cities. Videos circulated of mobilized men sleeping on floors in abandoned facilities, complaining of inadequate equipment, being issued rifles decades old. This was not a surge of patriotic volunteers. It was a scramble. Mobilization exposed what the early invasion had concealed. Russia did not have the trained reserves it needed for a prolonged high-intensity conflict. Its professional army had taken severe losses. Officers were depleted. Experienced non-commissioned officers, the backbone of modern militaries, were scarce. And in their place came civilians with weeks of rushed preparation. The consequences played out on the battlefield. Russian forces increasingly relied on massed artillery and defensive fortifications rather than maneuver warfare. Advances slowed to meters rather than kilometers. Casualties continued. Progress became measured not in cities captured, but in villages reduced to rubble. Then came another shift: the growing reliance on irregular formations. Private military contractors, most prominently the Wagner Group, expanded their role. Wagner recruited from prisons, offering reduced sentences in exchange for frontline service. Convicted criminals were deployed in brutal assaults, often with staggering casualty rates. This was not a sign of strategic strength. It was a sign of manpower desperation. At the same time, cracks began appearing inside the military hierarchy. High-ranking officers were dismissed. Command structures reshuffled. Responsibility shifted. In authoritarian systems, failure rarely travels upward. It is reassigned, quietly, but the losses continued. Western intelligence estimates suggested tens of thousands of Russian casualties within the first year alone. Equipment losses mounted: tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft. Sanctions constrained Russia's ability to replace advanced components, particularly microelectronics critical for modern weapons systems. Factories worked overtime. But supply chains had been severed. Modern war consumes material at astonishing rates, and Russia's defense industry, though large, was not built for sustained conflict under economic isolation. The consequences became visible in adaptation. Older tanks reactivated from storage, missile stockpiles drawn down, increased use of less precise munitions, reliance on imported drones from Iran. This was not the image of a self-sufficient military superpower. It was the image of a state compensating. Inside Russia, the narrative remained tightly controlled. State television emphasized resilience, sacrifice, patriotism. Losses were minimized, successes exaggerated, but information leaks in modern war. Soldiers post videos, families ask questions. Military bloggers, some fiercely nationalist, began criticizing leadership openly, not for waging war, but for waging it incompetently. This is an important distinction. The discontent was not ideological opposition to the war itself, it was anger at its execution. That kind of anger is dangerous in a system built on projected strength, because when the promise is competence, and competence fails, legitimacy erodes. What Vladimir Putin built over 2 decades was a political identity anchored in control, stability after chaos, order after humiliation, strength after weakness. The army was central to that identity. And in Ukraine, that army faltered. This does not mean Russia cannot continue fighting. It can. It has manpower. It has resources. It has the capacity to inflict enormous destruction. But the illusion of effortless dominance is gone, and illusions are powerful things in geopolitics. They deter adversaries, they discourage resistance, they reinforce authority. When they collapse, recalculations begin inside and outside the system. Ukraine recalculated first, then Europe, then NATO, and now increasingly Russia itself must confront a truth it tried to suppress. The army it sent into Ukraine was not ready for the war it started. And the longer this war continues, the more that gap between image and reality, between power and performance, widens. In part 3 of this series, we turn to the other side of that widening gap, because while Russia struggled with corruption and mobilization, Ukraine was transforming, not alone, but with help, systematic help, lethal help, strategic help from the United Kingdom, from the United States, from NATO allies who understood that if Ukraine fell, the map of Europe might not stop shifting. That transformation, quiet at first, then decisive, changed the trajectory of this war, and it changed the balance of power far beyond the battlefield.